The morning the ice storm took my greenhouse, I was standing in my kitchen watching 41 years of work disappear through the window. I had built that greenhouse with my own hands the spring after my husband Gerald passed. He had always said we would expand the nursery together, move beyond the roadside stand we'd been running since our 30s, and turn it into something real, something that could outlast us both. He never got the chance, so I did it alone, board by board, pain by pain, through 2 bad knees and a back that had never forgiven me for the years of bending and lifting. I called it Hartwells, after our family name, and for more than 4 decades, it had been the best-known garden nursery in our corner of Nova Scotia. People drove from 3 towns over for my heritage tomato seedlings in May. Church ladies planned their whole spring planting around my perennial stock. The high school agriculture class came every October to learn how to overwinter their cuttings. Hartwells wasn't just a business, it was a living thing. And on the morning of February the 9th, the ice came down so heavy and so fast that the entire east-facing wall of the greenhouse buckled inward, and the roof followed, and everything I had grown from seed, the lemon verbena, the heirloom roses I had been propagating for 6 years, the jasmine cuttings I was saving for the spring market, all of it was crushed under 2 tons of ice and glass. I stood at that window in my housecoat and I did not cry. I think I was too old for the kind of crying that makes noise. What I felt was quieter than that, and heavier. The feeling of watching something irreplaceable become rubble. The feeling of knowing that the damage was not just structural, the main heating system had been destroyed in the collapse, and without heat, the remaining plants in the secondary growing room would be dead within 48 hours. The cost of rebuilding, at my age, with my savings, was simply not possible. I knew that within the first hour, I had run the numbers enough times in my life to understand them quickly. What I did not know yet was how much worse the next 2 days would become. My daughter Renee had been living 40 minutes away in Dartmouth since her marriage 12 years ago. Her husband, a man named Clifford, who had always looked at my calloused hands and muddy boots the way people look at something they are embarrassed to be associated with, had made clear from early on that he considered the nursery an eccentricity at best, a liability at worst. He had suggested twice in the past 5 years that I consider selling the property and moving somewhere more manageable, by which he meant somewhere that did not require him to occasionally help load soil bags when he visited. I called Renee the morning after the collapse, once I had confirmed the full extent of the damage and accepted that I could not stay in the house. The heating system failure had spread. The pipes in the north wall of the house itself had cracked overnight, and the temperature inside had dropped to the point where I could see my breath in the kitchen. I packed a bag. I called my daughter. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what had happened, keeping my voice steady, the way I had always done in emergencies. I had learned that from Gerald. He used to say that panic is a luxury, and that people in genuine trouble cannot afford it. Renee was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said she needed to speak with Clifford. I said of course, and I waited, standing in my kitchen with my coat on and my bag at my feet, the cold pressing in through the cracked wall. She called back 11 minutes later. I counted. She said that Clifford felt it wasn't a good time. His mother was already staying in their guest room for a medical appointment in the city. There simply wasn't space. She said it in the careful, practiced way people use when they have been coached on what to say, when the words belong to someone else but they are delivering them as if they are their own. I asked if there was somewhere I could sleep temporarily, the couch perhaps, even a few nights. There was a pause. Then Renee said quietly that Clifford had pointed out that the nursery property had probably gone to ruin years ago and that I had been too stubborn to see it, and that perhaps this was the moment to think seriously about a transition plan. A senior's residence. Something practical. I did not respond to that. I said thank you. I would figure something out, and I ended the call. I sat down at my kitchen table in my coat, and I stayed there for a long time. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because I think some of you will know it. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something older than anger. It was the specific grief of discovering that a relationship you had been tending carefully for years, the way you tend a plant you are not entirely sure is still alive, has in fact been hollow for a very long time. Renee had not refused me because there was no space. She had refused me because Clifford had decided my situation was inconvenient, and she had let that decision stand. And I understood, sitting at that table, that she had been letting his decisions stand on my behalf for a long time. I called the one hotel in town. No vacancy, 2 other families displaced by the same storm had already taken every available room. I called my neighbor Phyllis, who was 78 and living alone, and would have opened her door without hesitating, but whose house ran on the same grid I did and had its own damage. I called the church hall coordinator and left a message. I was running out of options by the time the light outside began to go gray, and the temperature inside the house dropped another 2 degrees. It was sitting there, in that deepening cold, that I thought of Sophie. Sophie Marchant. I had not spoken her name aloud in probably 3 years, though I thought of her occasionally the way you think of someone who changed the shape of your life without either of you intending it. She was 34 years old now. The last time I had seen her in person, she had been 22, just finishing her MBA, stopping by the nursery to buy a housewarming arrangement for her first apartment in Halifax. She had hugged me at the door the way she always had, with her whole self, no reservation, and told me she would visit more. I knew she would try. I knew also that life had a way of narrowing the space for old promises. Sophie had come into my life when she was 7 years old, and I was 46. Her parents had separated abruptly that spring, and her mother, a quiet woman named Diane, who worked at the post office and had no family nearby, had needed someone reliable to look after Sophie in the hours between school and her evening shift. A mutual acquaintance had suggested me. I was already running the nursery full-time by then, but the timing worked. Sophie would arrive at 3:30 and stay until her mother picked her up at 7. What I had not expected was how entirely at home she would feel in the greenhouse. From her very first afternoon, she wanted to know everything. Why do some seeds need cold before they'll grow? What does it mean when leaves curl at the edges? Can you grow a lemon tree in Nova Scotia if you love it enough? I answered every question as honestly as I could, which sometimes meant saying, I don't know, let's find out together. We spent 3 winters doing exactly that, building a small cold frame together, experimenting with succession planting, keeping a shared notebook of what worked and what didn't. She called it their research journal. She took it with her when her mother remarried and moved to New Brunswick, and I hope she still has it somewhere. What happened in the years after was something I watched from a careful distance, the way you watch weather moving in from the horizon. Sophie was brilliant in the particular way that cannot be manufactured, the kind that comes from genuine curiosity sustained over many years. She finished her commerce degree with distinction, took a position with an agricultural technology firm in Ontario, and within a decade had founded her own company, Verdant Solutions. It worked with small farms and rural food producers across Atlantic Canada, providing affordable infrastructure support, cold storage, processing technology, cooperative distribution networks. By the time Sophie was 32, Verdant Solutions had been profiled in the Globe and Mail twice, and Sophie herself had been named to a national list of the 100 most influential people in Canadian agriculture. I had read both articles. I had not reached out. It felt presumptuous. She had her own life, her own world. I was the woman who had answered her questions about lemon trees when she was 7. That was a lovely thing, but it was a long time ago, and I did not think it entitled me to anything. Sitting in my cold kitchen with a packed bag and nowhere to go, I turned her name over in my mind, the way you turn a stone over in your hand, feeling its weight, uncertain what to do with it. I told myself I would not call. I found her number anyway. She had sent me a holiday card 2 Decembers ago with her cell number written inside, with a note that said, "Please use this." I mean it, and I sat holding my phone for a long time before I understood that my hands were shaking from the cold and that I needed to make a decision. I dialed. She answered on the second ring. The sound of her voice, unhurried and warm and immediately present, undid something in me that I had been holding together very tightly. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said. And then, because she had always been perceptive, "What's happened?" I told her. I kept it brief. The storm, the greenhouse, the pipes, the cold. I did not mention Renee. I told her I was trying to find somewhere to stay for a few nights while I sorted out next steps, and that I was sorry to bother her, and that I simply wanted to ask if she knew of any options in the area, since her work took her through the province regularly. There was a short silence. Then Sophie said, "I'm in Truro. I can be at your door in 2 hours, don't move." I tried to tell her that wasn't necessary, that I wasn't asking for that a suggestion would be more than enough. She said, "Mrs. Hartwell, you taught me how to take care of living things. You showed me that growing something requires patience and showing up every single day. I am showing up. Please let me." I did not have an answer to that. So I said, "All right." She arrived in 1 hour and 40 minutes. She came with a thermos of soup from a place she had stopped at on the highway, and she walked through the greenhouse damage without flinching, taking photographs and making notes in her phone, asking me practical questions in a calm voice that kept me calm in turn. She found a structural engineer she knew on the phone within 20 minutes. She booked me into a small inn in Wolfville, a good one, warm and quiet, and she drove me there herself and walked me inside and sat with me over soup at a corner table for 2 hours while I talked, and she listened the way she had always listened, completely, without impatience, without looking at her phone. I slept that night for the first time in 2 days. What happened over the following weeks was more than I had any right to expect. Sophie's company had an existing relationship with a contractor who specialized in agricultural infrastructure restoration. She arranged an assessment at her own expense. She connected me with a provincial grant program for rural agricultural recovery that I had not known existed, and it turned out I qualified for a significant portion of the rebuild cost. She helped me navigate the insurance claim with a precision that made me realize how thoroughly I had been underpaid on 2 previous claims over the years. She also, quietly and without announcement, arranged for the delivery of new heating infrastructure for the secondary growing room, covering the cost herself and telling me only that it was an investment because Verdant Solutions had been looking for a heritage seed preservation partner in the region for 2 years, and she could not think of a better one. It was generosity dressed as business, which is the most dignified kind. I did not learn until later, from her assistant who mentioned it in passing, that Sophie had rearranged 3 days of her own schedule that first week to be available for my situation, that she had driven back from Truro twice more than was necessary, that she had called the inn to make sure I was eating. Renee heard about the recovery approximately 6 weeks after the collapse through a neighbor who had seen the contractor vehicles at the property and mentioned it at church. She called me on a Tuesday evening. Her tone was different, warmer, in the way that warmth can sometimes be a performance. She said she had been thinking about me constantly and had felt terrible about the timing of everything during the storm. She asked how the rebuild was going. She said she hoped I knew that her door was always open. I listened. I was sitting in my restored secondary growing room by then, repotting the jasmine cuttings that had survived because Sophie had arranged emergency relocation for them within 48 hours of arriving. The room smelled like damp earth and green things. It smelled like mine again. I told Renee that things were going well. I thanked her for calling. I did not offer more than that, and I did not ask for more than she was giving. After I hung up, I sat for a while in the warm room, listening to the quiet. I thought about what Clifford had said, through Renee, on the day I called, that the nursery had probably gone to ruin and I had been too stubborn to see it, that it was time for a transition plan. And I thought about Sophie, at 7 years old, pressing her small palm flat against the cold frame glass to feel the warmth inside, and asking me why something would grow better if it was protected. Because it has a chance to become what it was meant to be, I had told her. She had written that down in the research journal. I wonder sometimes if she still remembers. The greenhouse reopened in May, 6 weeks ahead of the contractor's original estimate. The heritage tomato seedlings sold out in 3 days. The church ladies came back. The high school agriculture class booked their October visit. One of Sophie's colleagues from Verdant Solutions drove down on a Saturday with her children and spent 2 hours asking questions about heirloom seed saving, and I answered every one as honestly as I could. And when the youngest asked if you could grow a lemon tree in Nova Scotia if you loved it enough, I smiled and said, "Let's find out together." I am 67 years old. I have outlasted a grief that nearly ended me, a winter that destroyed 40 years of work, and a moment when the people I expected to hold me up looked the other way. I am still here, and so is Hartwells, and so is the Jasmine. There are things I have really learned, the way you only learn things that have cost you something that I want to say plainly before I finish. The people who show up in your hardest moments are telling you the truth about who they are. So are the people who don't. Pay attention to both. Kindness given without expectation of return is not naivety. It is the most rational investment a person can make because its interest compounds in ways you cannot predict and cannot control. I spent 7 years answering a little girl's questions about plants. I did not do it for any reason other than that she wanted to learn and I wanted to teach. What came back to me 47 years later, when I needed it most, was something I could never have planned for. You cannot manufacture that. You can only live in a way that makes it possible. And this, do not let the people who diminish you define the size of your life. Clifford decided my nursery was a ruin and my situation was an inconvenience. He was wrong on both counts. But even if he had been right, even if the nursery had been a ruin and the situation had been impossible, I would still have deserved a place to sleep in a storm. We all do. Your value is not a function of your productivity or your property or what you can offer someone in return. You existed before all of those things, and you will be worthy of dignity long after they are gone. The ice came down hard that February. It took the greenhouse and the heating and the lemon verbena I had been growing for 3 years and the particular sense of security that comes from believing your family will be there when the worst happens. But it did not take Hartwells, and it did not take me. If you have ever been helped by someone you least expected, someone who appeared without obligation, without calculation, simply because they chose to, I hope you have told them. I hope you have said it plainly and meant it. I said it to Sophie over the phone last week, as carefully as I could, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You taught me first." That is everything, I think. That is the whole of it. Thank you for staying with me.